All right, everyone, I want to talk to you guys about an observation that I have in my mind, and I want to put it through you guys and see what you guys think about this. So, we just recently saw the breach of the Capitol building. And of course, you have righties saying, oh, it was great, it was wonderful, it was glorious, we should do it again. And you have people who are more prudent saying, no, 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 we don't need that because that just means more political instability, and political instability creates the atmosphere for civil unrest, violence, and, in the most nightmarish possibility, civil war. And we don't want America to become Syria or the Balkans. So we saw what took place in the Capitol building, and now the FBI has put out a warning about the possibility of right-wing fanatics, paramilitaries, and militias breaching the Capitol buildings of all 50 American states. And if this actually takes place, it would definitely be a coordinated effort for a revolution. And the FBI has also warned about one particular paramilitary organization, stating that if the 25th Amendment is implemented against Donald Trump, they will do an armed uprising. So what does this tell us? Well, you know, the FBI warns us about Islamic terrorism when ISIS was killing people, and the Islamic fundamentalists were butchering people in the Middle East and in Europe, and also in the United States as well. The FBI put out warnings, just as in Europe, MI5 put out warnings about, you know, the possibility of major Islamic terrorist attacks. So the FBI is warning us about this. When the FBI warned us about Islamic terrorism, what was that a sign of? It was a sign about the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Simple as that. So what this tells us is that we are living in a political atmosphere where the ideas of revolution, in this case right-wing revolution, are becoming more and more popular. They are becoming more and more popular. For years, we have been hearing warnings about the threat of right-wing violence and terrorism. We laughed it off. We said, oh, no, that's just liberal fear-mongering. And then we saw it manifested in the Capitol building. And we also saw it in various other ways. There was the massacre that took place in Walmart in El Paso. It's popped up in various different ways. Right-wing violence tends to manifest itself in different ways than left-wing violence. Lefties tend to riot a lot more. They tend to go after private property. Righties, they just want to go straight to the point. Let's hit the Capitol building. They want to hit right for the jugular. But nonetheless, we are living in a zeitgeist of revolution. The spirit of the age consists of revolt, rebelliousness, revolution. And I am going to argue that the events that we have been seeing recently, be it the riots of the summer of 2020, or be it what just took place in the Capitol building, these events are merely reflections of the spirit of the age. I'm going to argue this. This is my observation. Remember what happened in 2011. Let's go back into recent memory, and let's from there, let's go forward to now, and let's see this series of events and how they are paralleled and how they really reflect the spirit of the age. So in 2011, we saw the Occupy movement, and that was accelerated by the 2008 economic disaster. And then, also in the year 2011, we saw the beginning of the Arab Spring. What was that? Revolution, right? We saw it in Egypt, and then eventually it escalated in Syria, Libya, Iraq, and the Middle East has been utterly devastated by it. And what did all of that instability lead to? Well, it eventually gave rise to Turkey, and Turkey is now taking advantage of all of the political unrest and instability and using it to bolster its position and really start Turkish expansionism, which is what we have been seeing in Syria and also in the Eastern Mediterranean, also in Libya as well. So there's that. And then you go to 2015. In 2015, we saw the Pegida demonstrations in Germany. These were massive rallies that consisted of tens of thousands of people in each rally throughout Germany. And they were all about what? Nationalism and immigration. And those two go hand in hand. It was all about getting rid of Merkel. It was about hating the current established government. It was about getting rid of the immigrants, getting rid of the migrants. It was all about that. And that was a sign that nationalism was becoming extremely popular. The popularity of nationalism was very real, and it was thick in the air. And those demonstrations went on into the year 2016. What happened in the year 2016? Brexit. The majority of British people who voted in the referendum were in favor for splitting from the European Union. Why? A lot of that had to do with nationalism. And finally, Brexit just got officialized. So Britain is no longer a part of the European Union, and that's that. So there's that. And the breakup of the European Union has led to what? The rise of Germany. Because now Germany can do its dream, it can fulfill its dream of a European Union military force, a pan-European military force led by Germany, because Britain is not there to stop it. So just as the instability in the Middle East led to the rise of Turkey, the splitting of the European Union, the fragmenting of the European Union is leading to the rise of Germany. So there's that. 2017, we saw the right-wing surge. And we were seeing it before, but we saw it, we began to see it really take control of positions within governments, Western governments. In 2015, we saw the Pegida demonstrations. 2016, we saw Brexit. Also in 2015, we saw the rise of Trump in American politics. And I know, we're all supposed to sit here and worship Donald Trump as if he's some kind of a savior, but the bottom line is that Trump is merely a symptom of the zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, is that of nationalism and rebellion against the established government status quo. So in 2017, we saw the beginning of Trump's presidency. Also in 2017, we saw various right-wing parties win substantial seats in various European governments. For example, and I've said this many times, in the Netherlands, we saw the Dutch Freedom Party, led by the Dutch nationalist Geert Wilders, take a substantial amount of seats. It got second place in the Dutch elections. We also saw the AfD take a substantial number of seats in the German parliament. We saw also the Sweden Democrats take a lot of power in the Swedish government. Sweden Democrats is a nationalist party in Sweden, which was founded by literally Nazis. They were founded by Nazi SS officers. We also saw in 2017 the Austrian People's Party and the Austrian Freedom Party, both fascistic and Nazistic parties, take control of the Austrian government. We also saw in the year 2017 the rise in Catalonian nationalism. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating in the streets in various demonstrations that lasted for months, all in favor for Catalonia splitting from Madrid. And there was a referendum in Catalonia, and regardless of the fact that it was illegal, the reality was that the majority of the Catalonians wanted, and they still want, to split from Madrid. They still want to split from the Union. The Union. They want to split from Spain. I guess you could call it the Spanish Union. So that was a sign of political instability. That was a sign of destabilization in Europe, the breakdown of European unity. We saw it. In 2018, we saw the rise of the Yellow Vest movement. And it wasn't exactly a revolution. They were demonstrations. They were very, very violent riots as well. And nonetheless, though, these people wanted revolution. They wanted revolution. They were people holding nooses to express their desire to hang, or they actually, no, they didn't have nooses. They had guillotines. Actually, that's nooses. That's an American thing. No. These people had guillotines. They had little mock guillotines out because they wanted to behead Emmanuel Macron and they wanted to behead French politicians. These people were fanatics. They talked about shooting police officers. They talked about killing politicians. These people were serious about revolution. They were rioting. They were expressing their desire for violence. And that happened in France, and that began in 2018. It continued on into 2019. But because of COVID, those demonstrations were silenced. So then what happened in 2020? You had coronavirus, and that forced businesses to shut down. It led to unemployment, massive amounts of unemployment. Now you have tens of millions of Americans who can't pay their rent. It is economic instability. And then what the COVID shutdown did was it began to further expose how divided America is. It began to expose the polarized American society. And that was already known, but COVID exposed it further. It just merely shed more light on the reality of just how incoherent and really how incohesive American society is. Because you had all these demonstrations against the lockdown, tremendous amounts of hatred for governors was manifested in protests, especially in Michigan, where armed protesters went right into the government building. And so there was that. And then you had the whole George Floyd situation. Oh my God. That was absolute hell. You had tremendous amounts of hatred against the police. And it wasn't just for George Floyd, it was for other people as well. Rayshard Brooks, Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor. But it all began with George Floyd. And for months in this country, they were horrifically violent riots. These weren't just protests. These were riots. And there was billions of dollars in property destruction. And it was just havoc and chaos. And these people who were doing the property destruction, they wanted and they still want revolution. They were attacking cops. They were destroying property. They wanted revolution. And then the Capitol building siege. The breaching of the Capitol that began right in January of 2021. It's like, oh, 2021's going to happen. Let's do our New Year's resolutions. It's going to be so much fun. 2020 is finally over. And then this happened. And now the FBI is warning about the potential for right-wing operatives breaching the Capitol buildings of the American states. And so many righties support it. People get mad at me when I condemn it. But the reality is that when people start attacking government property, when they start attacking cops, and yes, the righties did attack cops, one cop was murdered, it is a sign of political instability and social unrest, and it's not good. Society functions on a harmony between people and state. You can't have a country without government. It's impossible. But the relationship between people and state must be mutual. It has to be harmonious. It has to have equilibrium. People must like their politicians, or at least tolerate their politicians, because politicians are rarely ever really liked, but we tolerate them. And politicians have to treat their people well. While at the same time, taxation must be implemented in order to continue to finance the necessary functions of society. Police, electricity, we pay for electricity for private electric companies, but we have taxes for roads and police and fire departments and et cetera, et cetera. But if the people hate the government, then you have instability. If the people hate the government to the point where they're attacking cops, they're destroying private property or government property, and then they're just talking about revolution and armed uprisings, then you're going to have problems. And my fear is that America is going to become like Syria. That's my biggest fear. I hope it doesn't happen, but that's my fear. But you have all of these morons talking about, what we need is a civil war in this country, and they've been, I almost cussed. They have been fantasizing about civil war for decades, and now you have these lunatics who see their opportunity to bring their fantasy into reality, to bring their fantasy into fruition. So there's that. And I want to make really an historical comparison. In the 1830s to the late 1840s, there were a series of protests which eventually led into revolutions in Europe. It began as massive protests throughout Europe, but they eventually culminated and imploded into full-scale revolutions. These revolutions took place within the same year, 1848. Just a coincidence, guys. All these revolutions took place in Europe in the same year. They took place in France, they took place in Germany, they took place in Austria, they took place in Italy, they took place in Denmark, they took place throughout Europe. All within the same year. They all took place within the same year because that was the spirit of the age. It was a spirit of revolution. And the French overthrew the monarch. The French overthrew the monarch in the late 18th century, but the monarch came back. The monarchy was re-implemented in France. But then there was the what they called the February Revolution, which took place in 1848, and the French overthrew the monarch and replaced him with Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, Louis Bonaparte. And the rebels, they claimed that they wanted a republic where people could have rights, human rights, the universal rights of man, manhood suffrage. But what they ended up with was a dictator, which is why I'm always against revolution. I'm always against these revolutionary movements because I'm always worried about, well, what's going to come after the revolution? They always talk about revolution, but they never plan what the hell they're going to get after the revolution is done. What are you guys going to get? And that's the problem with rebels. They don't think these things out. They just want chaos. It's what I call Joker politics. Joker politics. That's what this is. It is the desire of chaos for chaos's sake, without any sort of strategy, without any sort of end goal in mind. And whatever their goal is chaos, but the goal of, having harmony in society, the goal of making sure that the next government is going to be one of civility, that the society is going to have civility, that there's going to be harmony, that's never thought out. That's never thought out. And so you have revolution, you have violence, a lot of people die, and then what ends up happening is you end up with a tyrant, like Louis Bonaparte, who was a dictator. So you got rid of the monarch, you ended up with a dictator. And then you had the various revolutions that took place within the German states. At this time, Germany was not a unified country. Germany did not unify until 1871. But nonetheless, there were just a body of German states. They recognized that they were German. They spoke the same language. They recognized that they shared a similar culture and that they were immediate neighbors. But nonetheless, Germans were not in a unified country. They were living in a body of separate states and principalities. But they did revolutions, and they did revolutions because of what? Nationalism. They were nationalists, and they had this dream of a unified German state. When the revolutions were over, the rebels, various German parliamentarians got together in the parliament in the region of Frankfurt, and they said, okay, let's make a unified Germany, but it didn't happen. They couldn't unify Germany because the left-wing revolutionaries and the right-wing revolutionaries could not agree on anything. So it didn't manifest. But in 1871, Germany was finally unified. So you could say, well, the revolution in 1848 was a failure, and in the immediate sense, you would be right. But nonetheless, it still reflected nationalism. It still reflected the spirit of the age, which was nationalism, and it was rebelliousness, and it was revolutionary thinking. And that's what we are living in. You see, and what accelerated those revolutions in 1848? What accelerated them? You had massive amounts of industrialization. Industrialization led to more and more people being unemployed. It also led to more and more people leaving the farm countries for the cities because they thought, well, they could have more money in city life. And they were probably wrong. And so you had crop failures. Crop failures led to food shortages. Food shortages led to what? A boom in the prices of food. And it came to the point where people were literally spending half of their incomes on food. And the average person could just live off potatoes and bread, which isn't bad. I mean, if you're living off potatoes and bread, you're not hungry, right? It's not the end of the world. But still, the fact that they had to spend half of their income for that, it was pretty bad. And this is when Karl Marx became popular. Karl Marx became popular around this time. Why was he so appealing? Because of the economic disasters in Europe, because of food shortages, because of the hike or the massive amounts of increase in food prices. People began to look towards revolutionary ideologies like Marxism. People also began to look towards revolutionary ideologies that were very nationalistic and that were very right-wing. That's why German nationalism became popular at this time. It was all the sign of the age. Today, what do we see? We see automation destroying jobs. We see economic diminishment leading to unemployment. We see big tech companies destroying small businesses and also controlling information. We are living in conditions similar to those prior to the revolutions of 1848. So today, what have we been living in within recent years? We saw the Arab Spring. Those were riots and revolutions, and that led to civil wars in Libya and also in Syria, in Iraq as well. We saw the surge in right-wing nationalist parties in Europe. We saw Brexit, Britain leaving the European Union. We saw the rise of Trump. We saw all of these things. A lot of this began in the Middle East, which is very fascinating. It's fascinating how these things spread, from east to west. Also with the rise in Indian nationalism in 2014, we can't forget that. With the rise of the BJP and Narendra Modi. So that's what we're living in. We're living in an age of rebelliousness and revolution. Now, who should we fear? Because you have people who say, well, we should just fear the government. And if you have these rebellions and if you have these breaches of government property, government's just going to get bigger and you're going to have more of a police state. So who should we fear? This is the conclusive question of this video. Who should we fear more? Should we fear the mob or should we fear the state? You have one side that says, well, we should just fear the mobs, right? These right-wing mobs are dangerous. They need to be controlled. But then you have people saying, no, we should just fear government. Well, to be fair, conservatives will say we should just fear the government when the government is responding to right-wing violence. But when the government needs to respond to left-wing violence, it's all about that big state. So righties are conservatives, American conservatives are hypocritical in that regard. If the government responds to right-wing violence, it's the big brother state. But if the government responds to left-wing violence, it's good. That's necessary. So that's the hypocrisy of it. But I think, and I propose a third position, and that is that I think we should fear both. We should, of course, fear government because government holds the power. In one sense, it holds the power because it's elected to do that. But in the other sense, we should also fear the mob. And I want to say that we should fear the mob more than the government because the mob has the numbers. And if the mob becomes big enough that it can engulf the government, then I fear the mob. If the mob takes over the government, then God help us, because then at that point we're living in the next Reich. If you have left-wing mobs take over the government or some aspect of the government, then you'll have communism. If you have right-wing mobs take over the government or some part of the government, you're going to have a Nazi state. You'll have basically Nazism getting implemented, fascism being implemented. That is the danger. But also, we also have to remember that if the mobs become too violent and they are popular, if those mobs are popular, that will eventually reflect the state of government, because the government is simply a state of the people. The government is a reflection of the spirit of the people. Politicians are there simply to represent various factions of society. People who are moderate liberals will vote for Democrats. People who are far left will vote for socialists. That's why you have socialists in office. People who are moderate conservatives will vote Republican. People who are right-wing nutcases, they will vote for right-wing nutcases. That explains the phenomena of Donald Trump. Politicians are merely reflections of society. They are merely reflections of us. So if we hate politicians, we might as well just hate our own society, because society society will eventually project itself in government. That's just the nature of the beast. So if mobs become popular, then the spirit of the mob will enter the government, and the government becomes tyrannical. The spirit of the mob will eventually affect the government, and the government becomes more tyrannical. It's like Napoleon Bonaparte. You had this horrific revolution. It slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people because the king was just so bad. And it left a giant vacuum, and Napoleon Bonaparte took over, and Bonaparte was more dictatorial than any monarch. So that's just the reality, guys. It's why we cannot support any mobs. We cannot support any sort of political violence because it's just going to lead to political instability. Political instability leads to nothing good. It's just no damn good. The whole thing is evil. The whole thing is evil. The Bible warns about this. It talks about the roaring of the seas, and the seas represent people. The seas are symbolic of people. The people roar, the heathen roar, and that's what we're seeing. We are living in an age of rebelliousness. We are living in an age of revolt. And we're living in scary times. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.